program is made possible by grants from Ford Motor Company. At Ford, quality is job one. And Ford Aerospace and Communications Corporation. Domino's Pizza, with more than 1,500 stores nationwide. And the L'Oreal Corporation, an international high-technology company committed to the leading edge of defense electronics and communications.
I was never popular as a boy. The popular ones were good at games and had big, tight fists. I was blind as a bat without my glasses, and to tell you the truth, kind of a sissy. If there was any danger of getting into a fight, I ran. There were about 3,000 books in the library in Independence, and I read every one of them, including the encyclopedias, by the time I was 14. If you want to stay out of the way of the boys with the fists, you stay in the library. Till you grow up, anyway. Well, my father was 5'6", 140 pounds, and he could whip anybody up to 200 got in his way. He was descended from Andrew Jackson. Those people were all fighters. He was a horse trader, horses and mules. Well, my mother taught us that things were either right or wrong. Punishment followed transgression, and punishment, as far as she was concerned, was a switch. And you didn't do whatever it was you did again. They say now that's not the way to do things, and maybe they're right. I don't know. All I know is that's the way I was brought up. When I was 10, 11 years old, I got a job in Jim Clinton's drugstore on the northeast corner of the square, and I'd get there at 6:30, and I'd mop the floors, dust the bottles, and wipe the counter, and wake up Jim Clinton at 7. But I had a lot of customers before he got up, churchgoers. The hi-hats in town, the ones who were afraid to go into a saloon and order a drink, they'd come in before most people were up and around, and they'd pay their dime. I'd set out the whiskey bottle, and they'd say, "Harry, pour me a drink." And now there were saloons all around that square, and the tough old birds in town, the ones that didn't give a damn what people thought, they'd go into the saloon and buy a drink when they wanted it. But the so-called good people, the hi-hats, the fancy ones, they'd come in and buy a drink behind a prescription counter from a boy who didn't have any right to sell it to them. Well, when I was 18, just out of high school, I took a job as a timekeeper on the Santa Fe Railroad. I was working with the fella that was building a double track between Eaton and Sheffield, Missouri. Well, he had 3 camps with 100 hobos in each. My job was to keep track how much time those old boys put in, then I'd sit up in Schmidt's saloon up in Sheffield and write out the paychecks. Now, they weren't bad fellas, not at all. Most of them had backgrounds that caused them to be hobos, family troubles, or they'd been in jail for some damn fool thing that wasn't a penitentiary offense, but they weren't bad citizens, no, sir, not in any way. I remember one time I told old man Schmidt, who ran the saloon, that this one old bastard was our blacksmith, and we needed him, so try to cut back on his whiskey. Well, that damn old Schmidt went out and told that blacksmith, and I'll tell you, I never got a better cussing in my life for interfering with the freedom of an American citizen, and he was right. I'll tell you what that taught me. It taught me who the underdog was and what he thought of the hi-hats. Felt just the same way I did about them. They didn't have any time for him, neither did I. I've always liked the underdog better than the hi-hat. Still do. Some of those hobos had a better education than the president of Harvard University, and they weren't stuck up about it either. Well, in 1904, I went to work in a bank in Kansas City. I was good at it, I guess, but, well, I never liked it much, adding up figures all day. Well, Teddy Roosevelt came through when I was working in Kansas City, and when it came time for him to speak, a bunch of us clerks from the zoo, I called it. That's the little cage where we worked. Half a dozen of us left our desks and ran down the street to listen to Teddy. And he had this high tenor voice, carried real well, and he made a real good speech, too. But nobody really wanted to hear him speak. They just wanted to see him grin and show his teeth, which he did. He was a short man, about 5'6" or so. But, well, Roosevelt's none of them were very big people. But, well, they all seemed to have a whole lot of teeth to show. Well, when I was in Kansas City, I decided that playing the piano wasn't a thing for a fella to do. I'd been taking lessons, practicing for a couple hours a day since I was 6, but I just stopped. And that was probably all for the best. I never would have been a first-rate concert pianist. First-rate piano player in a whorehouse, not much more. You know, I played that Chopin Opus 42 waltz for old Stalin when we were in Potsdam. I think he was quite impressed. Churchill wasn't. Churchill never was a listener. Well, when Margaret put on her singing program in Washington, that was just a wonderful program. Now, she was scared, of course. Who wouldn't be? But that was just the best program ever. And then the next morning, this Paul Hume of the Washington Post, he wrote the dirtiest, meanest critique you ever saw in your life. Well, I sat right down and I wrote him a letter, and I told him if I get my hands on him, I'd bust him in the jaw and kick his nuts out. Well, General Marshall, he thought Margaret was his daughter anyway. He's just crazy about Margaret. Well, when I told him what I'd done, he said he was sorry I couldn't get my hands on the son of a bitch because that's what he deserved. He criticized everything but the varnish on the piano, and that's the only thing that needed criticizing. Well, when Bess and Margaret found out what I'd done, they cried and carried on and said I'd ruined Margaret and I don't know what all, and I said, now you just wait and see. Every man in the United States who's got a daughter is going to be on my side. Turned out they were. Well, my father died, and my brother Vivian, he had a place of his own, so my sister Mary Jane and I ran the farm for my mother, and then World War I came along and I signed up. I went to French artillery school for a while, and then one day this colonel called me into his office and he told me that I was going to be the new captain of Battery D. Well, Battery D was known as Dizzy D, and it had, to say the least, a very bad reputation. Now, they'd had 4 commanding officers in less than a year. Not one of them could control those Irish boys. They were most of them from Kansas City, and I'll tell you, they were wild. Well, I told that colonel, you might as well send me home right then and there. I was never so scared in my life, not even later when we were under fire. But it was a job I had to do, so I did it. Well, one of those fellows from Battery D is a barber now in Kansas City, and he's cut my hair ever since we got back from Europe. That's 50-some-odd years. He's retired now mostly, except for the fellows from Battery D. Well, when I got back to Independence, I asked Bess to marry me, and she thought that was a fine idea. But her mother was a very difficult person, to put it mildly. If anybody was high society in Independence, Mrs. Wallace was. Nothing was too good for her. Mostly it wasn't good enough, and that included me. Of course, I wasn't what you'd consider a promising prospect. I was 35. I'd worked on a railroad, in a bank, I'd done some farming, I'd been to war, and I was about to go into the haberdashery business with, of all things, a Jew. You know, in all the years I worked with Eddie Jacobson and all the things we went through together, he never once set foot in this house in Independence. This was Mrs. Wallace's house. Mrs. Wallace was society. Society did not have Jews in their houses. And when we were in the White House, not a day would go by when she wouldn't tell anybody to listen to her that she knew 10, 12 people make a better president than Harry Truman. Harry Truman was nothing but a dirt farmer. Well, I was a dirt farmer, and I was a damn good dirt farmer. Seems to me you do what you have to do to make a living. If it's not one damn thing, it's another. I think the measure of success is in how well you do it, not in what it is you're doing. Well, in 1922, the haberdashery went broke. Now, we didn't go into bankruptcy, although that's what they told us to do. We paid our creditors back, every single one of them. Took us 15 years to do it, but we did it. Well, I was broke and out of a job, and I had a wife and baby daughter to support, so when it was suggested that I might run for county judge of the Eastern District of Jackson County, I decided to do it. I had a lot of friends in that part of the county, and I was kin to the rest. Well, I went around in an old Dodge Roadster, and I stopped and spoke wherever I could find anybody to listen to me, you might say. I was opposed by the Ku Klux Klan, which in Jackson County was a strong arm of the Republican Party. And I went to one of their meetings. It was in the daytime, so they didn't have their sheets on. And there must have been 1,000 people there, and I knew every damn one of them. Well, I got up and I told them that my partner in the haberdashery business, Eddie Jacobson, had told me that the organizer of the Klan had to be a Jew, because only a Jew could sell a $1.95 bedsheet as a $16 nightgown. That's what it cost them to get in, you see. And I said to him that, in my opinion, if a man had to work behind a sheet, he was nothing but a goddamn coward. Well, people said it wasn't wise to go telling off the Klan like that, but, well, when a man starts to thinking about what's wise to say and what isn't, he might as well just curl up his toes and die. Keep your mouth shut about what the things you think are important. Well, hell, I don't see how you can expect a democratic system to work at all. Well, I worked my way up in the county government for some years, and then old Tom Pendergast, He got him to pass $1 million bond issue for roads, and he called me into his office in Kansas City. And there were all these birds in there, local contractors. And they said they deserved to have the contracts for building roads because they were local people, local taxpayers, and that sort of thing. And I said to them, well, I don't give a damn who you are or where you're from. I'm going to give those contracts to the lowest bidder who can get the job done. And I didn't care if he was from California, China, or the moon. Well, old Tom Pendergast, he laughed, and he said that he'd warned them that I was a contrary goddamn mule in Missouri, and they left. They were sore as hell, too, and they were mumbling and complaining about it, but they left. And afterwards, old Pendergast told me that I was to carry out my commitments as I saw fit. And that's exactly what I did. But Tom Pendergast died a week after I was sworn in as vice president. Well, people said I shouldn't go to his funeral, seeing as how he'd been in jail for income tax evasion, taking bribes, and I don't know what all. They said I should send a note or something. Well, I couldn't do that. Tom Pendergast was a good and loyal friend of mine, and he never asked me to do a dishonest deed. I went to that funeral. And you should have heard the carrying on. Headlines in the newspapers, editorials, and I don't know what all. But I couldn't do anything else. Now, what kind of a man wouldn't go to his friend's funeral just because he's going to be criticized for it? Well, in 1934, I was finished with the county. I'd done my job. Wasn't any more reason for me to stay there than what it was for me to stay in the White House in 1952 when I finished what I set out to accomplish there. So I filed for the U.S. Senate. And the newspapers had a field day, making fun of the little county judge and never been to college, wasn't a lawyer, running for the U.S. Senate. There's a lot of jokes, I can tell you. But I went into every county in this state, and I talked in all kinds of places, in little towns, country stores, and I shook people's hands, and sometimes there wouldn't be more than 2 or 3 people there, but I'd go on in there and I'd shake their hands, and I'd say I was a farmer and a failed businessman, and that I understood the problems facing the common people because I was one myself. And I told them that they could see, despite what the newspapers were saying, I didn't have horns and a tail. Well, Roosevelt was just getting his New Deal underway at that time, and, well, I told the people I was a supporter of Roosevelt and his policies, and I told them why. I said that for the first time since Woodrow Wilson, there was a president who had the welfare of the people at heart. I made, I suppose, 15, 20 speeches a day, and not a soul thought I had a chance in hell. I didn't say anything fancy or put on any paint or powder. I just told the people the facts, and the people believed me. And I spent some time getting to know the people in the county courts. Eventually, there wasn't a precinct in Missouri where I didn't have a friend. Well, there wasn't somebody to see to it that I got the votes that were voted for me. They didn't have to cheat, and it wasn't necessary. All they had to do was see to it that things got added up all right. Well, I had a plurality of 40,000 in the primary, and I went on to win that election. Senator Harry Truman. So we moved to Washington. Now, Margaret wasn't any too happy about that, and neither, I believe, was Mrs. Truman, but, well, that's how it had to be. I'll tell you the truth, I wasn't comfortable either at first. I didn't like the Senate. I was ignored, or at best, I was referred to as a senator from Pendergast. Then one day, old Ham Lewis, he's a Democratic whip. He came up to me and he said, Harry, first 6 months, you're going to wonder how the hell you got here. And after that, you're going to wonder how the hell the rest of us got here. And that's pretty much the way it worked out. Well, in 1940, I was determined to run for re-election. I slept in the car half the time to save the money I would have spent on the hotel. That was the worst campaign I ever went through in my life. Well, now, because of my committee work, you see, all the money in the state was against me. Big papers, influential people, and there wasn't anything they wouldn't do to beat me. They foreclosed on my mother's farm. Some squint-eyed old bastard who was head of the county government thought that'd be a good way to embarrass me. That was a sad sight to see, to have to move an old lady of 88 and all her furniture and everything else off her home place, but they went right ahead and did it. Well, most of the people in Missouri had mortgages, and a good number of them had been foreclosed a time or two, so I don't think it really did me a bit of harm. And then they put Tom Pendergast in jail for income tax evasion, and they said, the papers, that if I didn't denounce the man, well, then I must have the same dirt in my pockets. Well, I'm not going to kick a friend who's in trouble, no matter how many votes it might win me. I talked about Roosevelt and the New Deal and how it ought to be supported, and Democratic achievements in Congress, and I didn't blow my own horn, didn't have to. People caught on. And I talked about civil rights. That was in Sedalia, Missouri, and I was talking to nothing but white faces, and a good number of them were Klan members, and I said that I believed in the brotherhood of man. And I didn't mean just white men, but the brotherhood of all men. And I told them that I believed in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that if any class or race could be pushed down below the rest in political and civil rights, well, then so could any other class or race when the time came. And I told them it was their duty to see to it that the colored in their locality got increased opportunities to exercise their rights as free men. You see, if you believe in the Constitution, well, then everybody's got to have their rights, and that means everybody, and it doesn't matter a damn who they are or what color they are. And if you start making exceptions, well, then you just might as well not have a Constitution at all. You don't play fast and loose with that. Well, I wound up the campaign like I always did in Independence. We had a rally out there at the football field. There was a good crowd, too. Had hot dogs and Cokes and a high school band and all my relatives. They turned out even when they thought I was going to lose. Well, when I went to bed, old Stark was 11,000 votes ahead, and I thought for sure I was a goner. And about 3 in the morning, they called me from St. Louis and said, Harry, you're 5,000 votes ahead, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch says you're elected. And it was a good thing it turned out like that, too. I was 56 years old, and I didn't have the credentials to be much anything else. Well, when I got back to Washington, I walked into the Senate. They all stood up. Republicans, Democrats alike, they all stood up and applauded. The Missouri dirt farmer was back. You know, that's one of the reasons I didn't want the vice presidency when they started talking about that. I like the Senate. It's one of the greatest, it may be the greatest legislative body in the history of the world. Come on, we'll take a walk. Well, then we got into the Second World War, and all of a sudden, the sky was the limit for defense spending. No questions asked. And those economy boys, the ones who fussed over every nickel that was spent on welfare, they didn't open their mouths when it was for defense, and I don't understand it. I didn't then, I don't now. I do know from my experience that military men don't know anything about money. All they know is how to spend it, and they don't give a damn if they're getting their money's worth or not. And I know a good many of them feel that the more they spend, the more important they are. Well, I went back to the Senate, and I saw to it to set up the committee to investigate the defense program. They called it the Truman Committee after a while, Truman being shorter. Well, a couple of senators and myself, we went down to the airport they were building between Fort Worth and Dallas because, well, their payrolls are just outrageous. But somebody tipped them off, and they straightened everything out, and everything looked perfectly fine. But there was this one great big hangar, kind of a basement that was above ground, and I said, what's inside there? And they said, oh, that's nothing. That's just a basement for storage. And I said, that's fine. Why don't you just lift up that trap door there, and we'll have a look. I counted 600 men come out of there. Glenn Martin was building B-26 bombers, and they were crashing and killing kids right and left. And I asked him, what's wrong with those goddamn airplanes? And he said, the wing spread isn't wide enough. And I said, why the hell aren't you making it wider? And he says, I don't have to. I got a contract. And I said, that's just fine. That's just fine. I'll see to it your contract's canceled and you don't get another one. And he says, oh, well, if you feel that way about it, we'll fix it. I don't understand people like that. Now, he was killing kids, murdering them, and he didn't give a damn. I never will understand people who can do a thing like that. Well, eventually, the Truman Committee saved the taxpayers in the neighborhood of $15 billion. What frightens me is, what if nobody'd been looking? I went to the Democratic Convention in 1944 to nominate Jimmy Burns for vice president. I had no thought of accepting the job myself and no idea that it was going to be offered to me. If it had been an offer, I'd have turned it down. I was happy right where I was in the Senate. I was doing the best I could. The best I could do could be done from the Senate, and I didn't want any changes. But what you want isn't always what you get. I had breakfast there in Chicago one Sunday with Sidney Hillman of the CIO, and I told him I was going to nominate Burns, and he said, Harry, that's a mistake. Labor's never going to support Burns. He's against labor. I said, well, who the hell do you want then? He said, well, we're supporting Henry Wallace, but we got a second choice, and I'm looking right at him. Well, next morning I had breakfast with Phil Murray, who was head of the CIO, and he said pretty much the same thing. I talked to every political and labor leader, and I knew them all, and not a single one of them was going to be for Burns. There's only two, they said, Henry Wallace or me. And I said, well, you needn't be for me, because I'm not going to be a candidate. Well, they held this meeting at the Blackstone Hotel, and Bob Hannigan was there. Now, he's an Irishman from St. Louis and a particular friend of mine. I made him postmaster general before he died. Well, Hannigan, he put in a call to Roosevelt. He was down in San Diego, and they finally got him on the phone. And, well, with Roosevelt, you didn't need a phone anyway. All you had to do was raise up the window. You could hear him. And he says, Bob, do you have that fellow lined up for the vice presidency? Bob says, no, he's a contrary son of a bitch. And Roosevelt says, well, you tell him if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war and maybe lose that war, that's up to him. Bang, slammed down the phone. Well, finally I said, all right, if that's the way the old man wants it, I'll do it. But who the hell's going to nominate me now? I've told everybody here I'm not going to be a candidate. Everybody I know is supporting somebody else. Well, Bob says, What about your colleague, Bennett Clark? He was the other senator from Missouri at the time. Well, I spent that afternoon and half the night trying to find Bennett Clark. And finally, about 5 in the morning, I found him up in the penthouse at the Sherman Hotel. That was the Democratic headquarters, and he was full of whiskey. Well, I found a pot of coffee, and I put it down on the table there next to the empty whiskey bottle, and I said, Bennett, they want you to nominate me for vice president. You going to do it? And after a long time, he says, yeah, Harry, I'll do it. Well, I called Bob, and I told him I found your boy, and he's cockeyed, and I don't know if you can get him ready or not, but I hope to Christ you can't. Well, Bennett Clark was there. He was 5 minutes late, but he nominated me. Now, I'll tell you, that's the worst time I ever spent in my life. It's an awful thing, you know, the crowds and the people trying to grab a hold of you all the time, and it's frightening. I did my best to keep Margaret and Bess out of it, but that didn't always happen. Oh, and that day, the boss turned to me, and she said, Harry, are we going to have to go through this for the rest of our lives? And I told her that I thought we would. I went to see Roosevelt in August when he got back from Hawaii. We had lunch out there in the backyard of the White House under the magnolia that Andy Jackson planted. And he said, I want you to do some campaigning for me. And I said, all right, you tell me where you want me to go, and I'll make some plane reservations. And he said, no, don't fly, ride the train. Can't both of us afford to take chances. Well, Eddie Jacobson came to the White House maybe a month later, and we went outside, Eddie and I, and he said to me, Harry, you're going to be living here before long. That man in there is not well. And I said, Eddie, I'm afraid I am, and it scares me to death. But I got an audience everywhere I stopped, and we stopped damn near everywhere. I remember a little town in Idaho. There were only 3 people showed up, and 3 school teachers, as I recall. And I gave them a speech. Wasn't their fault. They're the only ones there. And they deserve the same consideration as the audience at Madison Square Garden, and I believe I gave it to them. Well, we ran out of money several times. Money just to keep the train going, and, well, Eddie'd get on the phone, and he'd get, well, he wouldn't get big amounts, but he'd get some, enough to get us going again. Eddie was a genius at raising money. And so was Bob Hannigan. I remember when we were in Boston, and Hannigan was up in, at a suite in Ritz-Carlton, and he had old man Kennedy in there with him. And I walked in, and Kennedy started throwing rocks at Roosevelt, saying he'd cause a war and so on, and he said, Harry, what the hell are you doing campaigning for that crippled son of a bitch that killed my son Joe? And I said, if you say one more word against Roosevelt, I'm going to throw you through that goddamn window. Well, Bob Hannigan, he got me by the arm and pulled me out of there. And then he went back in and got $10,000 from that son of a bitch. Well, old Joe Kennedy's as big a bastard as this country's ever had, and I don't like it a bit that he bought his son the nomination for the presidency. And he did. He bought West Virginia. I don't know how much it cost him. He was a tight-fisted old son of a bitch, so I know he didn't spend any more than he had to, but he bought West Virginia. And it wasn't only there. All over the country, old man Kennedy spent what he had to buy that nomination. He didn't buy the presidency itself, of course. Didn't have to. When you're running against a man like Nixon, oh, my, I do regret I never had a chance to run against him. Well, I never had any doubts about the election in 1944. I knew the people wouldn't want to change presidents in the middle of a war, and, well, there was just something about Dewey that people didn't trust. Now, he had a mustache, for one thing, and since at that time, during the war, people were aware of Hitler, that mustache didn't do him any good. Well, I came back to Independence like I always did on Election Day. We had a bunch of the fellows from Battery D and some other folks up at the penthouse at the Mulebuck Hotel. And they were worried as hell. I played a little piano music while we were waiting. Old man Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff, he was staying with him up at Hyde Park. He came down about 2 in the morning to raid the icebox or something, and Roosevelt was still awake, sitting in front of his radio. And he says to Leahy, I've been waiting for 2 hours for that son of a bitch to concede. Well, he didn't concede till 3:45 in the morning, you know. Same thing in 1948. Never did understand why that man was such a slow conceder. Well, I called my mama, and I asked her if she'd heard it on the radio, and she said she had. She'd heard it all. Now, you behave yourself up there, Harry. You behave yourself. That's all she said. And I said I would. You know, Roosevelt stood when he was sworn in. Now, at Yalta, when he made his speech, he sat in a wheelchair the whole time, but during the inauguration, he stood. He had his braces on, and you could see from his face that it was hard on him. He was in pain, I think, considerable pain, but But he stood there and he took the oath. And he didn't have an overcoat on or a hat, nothing but a thin suit. And it was a very cold day, and it may have even snowed some, I don't recall. His hands shook, and his voice wasn't steady. And Frances Perkins, his Secretary of Labor, she was crying, but she was careful not to let Roosevelt see her. That was a very sad sight to see, especially if you remembered how he sounded in former days. And 2.5 months later, he was dead. It was April 12th. It was an ordinary day. I was presiding in the Senate, and Senator Wiley was going on forever about nothing, and I was writing a letter to Mama. And they told me that Sam Rayburn wanted to see me over in his office. So I went over there, and before I could sit down, he said Steve Early, Roosevelt's press secretary, wanted me to call him, so I did. And he wanted me over there at the White House right away, and he wanted me to go right up to the second floor to Mrs. Roosevelt's rooms, and well, I didn't think anything about it. I thought maybe the old man was back from Georgia and wanted to talk to me about something. And then Mrs. Roosevelt, she told me the president was dead. Well, I was stunned, and I asked her if there's anything I could do for her, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she said, is there anything we can do for you, Harry? You're the one who's in trouble now. Well, they had an awful time finding a Bible. Now, I know there were plenty in the living quarters, but we were in the offices, and they just had a hell of a time. And Chief Justices and everybody standing around waiting to swear me in. Well, finally, they found a Gideon Bible, I believe it was. It had a red cover. And at 7:09 p.m., there was a clock on the mantel. I was sworn in as President of the United States. And then I went back to the apartment on Connecticut Avenue, and I had a sandwich with Bess and Margaret, and they were very upset over Roosevelt's death. And I called my mother in Grandview, and I told her everything was all right, not to worry. And I was going to be busy, so she probably wouldn't hear from me for a while. And then I did a lot of work. You know, I always thought, all the time I was president, that the work was going to let up. But it never did. It never got easier. And when I was done, I went to bed. You see, if you've done the best you can, then there's no sense worrying about it, because nothing in this world is going to change it. You have to give thought to what's going to happen the next day, what you have to be alert for. You see, what you're doing is more important than what you've done. That is, if you've done your best. A man can't do more than that. Another thing to remember when you get to be president is that, well, there are all these things, you see, the honors, the 21-gun salutes, all that sort of thing. Well, that's not for you. That's for the presidency. And you have to keep yourself separate from that in your mind. And if you can do that, well, things will probably work out all right. Now, we've had a few presidents who've been unable to keep that separation. Eisenhower, he got to where he wouldn't see anybody but millionaires. He forgot all about the common people. That had very bad results for this country. But we go through these periods, and it always works out all right in the end. Well, the first day of my administration was Friday the 13th. I called a meeting of the press, and I said, boys, if you've ever had a load of hay fall on you, then you know how I feel now. And I asked them to pray for me. Then I had a meeting with the chiefs of staff of the services, and they told me that the war in Europe was going to last another 6 months, and the war in Japan, a year and a half. Well, 3 weeks later, the war was over in Europe. There's another thing you have to remember when you're dealing with generals and admirals, that most of them, well, they're wrong a good deal of the time. And Washington knew that. He kept warning the people, Jefferson too, warning the people against letting the generals give you too much advice. I told you, they're like horses with blinders on. On Saturday, we went up to Union Station to meet Roosevelt's body. And on the way back to the White House, the streets were just jammed. There were people on both sides of the streets when we brought the body back. People were crowded together, and they were crying, and I saw one old nigger woman sitting on a curb with her apron up to her eyes, just crying her eyes out. Well, I went on the funeral train up to Hyde Park, and everywhere we stopped there'd be crowds of people just crying like the world was coming to an end. Well, I thought it was, too, to tell you the truth. And on the way back, old Harold Ickes, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, was going on and on about how the country's going to go to hell now that Roosevelt was dead. There wasn't any leadership left. He went on and on. He was a man who carried on a good deal. Now, he knew I could hear him. He had that in his mind. Well, I didn't fire him. I didn't have to. He was a resigner, you see. Roosevelt had torn up dozens of resignations from old Ickes. Anytime he hurt his feelings, he'd resign. Well, eventually I did, and he did, and I told him he could leave right away. I believe he wanted to stay on for for a couple of months, but he didn't. Well, then on Monday, I made a speech to the joint session of Congress. I wanted them to see and to hear the new president. You see, people were very confused, and some of them, they were frightened. And I wanted to let them know that Roosevelt's policies are going to go on. And then on April 20th, I was late for a meeting with Rabbi Wise, the Zionist. I was still having trouble with those Secret Service boys. Now, they wanted to drive me from Blair House to White House in one of those damn limousines. Now, can you imagine being driven across the street? Well, I wouldn't allow it. So we had something of an argument, and I was a little late that morning. And I was looking forward to that meeting, too. I knew he wanted to talk about Palestine, and, well, that's one area of the world that's always interested me, partly because of its biblical background, of course. You know, I read the Bible through twice before I went to school. I like the stories in it. They were stories about real people. Of course, I always read the King James Version, not one of those damn new translations they got lately. I don't know why it is. You got a good thing, you got to monkey around changing it. King James Version is the best there is, ever had been, or ever will be. You give it to some college professors, and they spend years and years working on it, and all they do is take all the poetry out. But it wasn't just the biblical side of it. The whole history of that area of the world is just about the most complicated and most interesting of any area anywhere, and I've always made a careful study of it. There's always been trouble there. Always been wars, from Darius and Ramses on. Well, anyway, he said, Mr. President, I'm not sure if you're aware of the reasons underlying the Jewish people's wish for a homeland. Well, he's just as polite as he could be, but in those days, nobody seemed to think I was aware of anything. And I told him I knew all about the Jews, and as far as I was concerned, the United States would do all it could to help the Jews set up a homeland. Well, he said he was sure there was a lot of people who weren't going to go along with me, including a lot of people in the State Department. Experts on the Middle East, he called them. Well, I said I knew all about the experts, that some of those striped pants boys had already sent me a memo telling me to watch my step. I didn't really understand what was going on over there, and that I ought to leave it up to them, to the experts. Well, an expert's a fella that's afraid to learn anything new, because then he wouldn't be an expert anymore. Well, he thanked me for my assurances, but the creation of Israel was up to the United Nations, and it took them 3 years. And in that 3 years, they put terrible pressure on the White House. It got so bad that I had to issue orders that I wasn't seeing anybody who was an extremist for the Zionist cause, and I didn't care who they were. Much as I favored a homeland for the Jews, I simply had other things to worry about. Well, then on March 13th, 1948, Eddie Jacobson called me from the Statler. And I said, Eddie, I'm always glad to see an old friend, but there's one thing you got to promise me. I don't want to hear one word about what's going on over there in the Middle East. Now, is that a promise? And he said it was. Well, when they showed him in here, he had these great tears coming down his cheeks. And I took one look at him, and I said, Eddie, you son of a bitch, I'd have you thrown out of here for breaking your promise. You know goddamn good and well I can't stand to see you cry. Now, he kind of smiled at me. Tears were still coming, though, and he said, thank you, Mr. President. Well, I got on the phone, I called the State Department, and I told them I was going to see Wiseman, the head of the World Zionists. Said, well, you should have heard the carrying on. First thing they said, well, Israel ain't even a country yet, and they don't have a flag. Now, if he comes here, what the hell are we going to use for a flag? And I told him, now, you look here. He's staying at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. Now, every time they have a foreign dignitary or something staying with them, they put something out there. Now, you find out what it is, and we'll use it. Well, he came to the White House on March 18th. 2 months later, Israel was a country born out of the United Nations like it should have been. And Wiseman was its first president. You know, I made 2 mistakes in my administration. One of them was setting up the CIA. Now we needed a central place for all the intelligence reports we were getting from all over the world, but, well, it got out of hand. Now, they got an organization over there in Virginia now that's practically equal to the Pentagon in many ways. And in my opinion, one Pentagon's one too many. As nearly as I can make out, those boys in the CIA, they don't just report on wars, they go out and make their own. And there's nobody to keep track of what they're doing. They spend billions of dollars stirring up trouble so they'll have something to report on. Well, they've become a government all their own, and they're all secret. And as far as I know, those birds don't have to report to anybody, and that's a very dangerous thing in a democratic society, and ought to be stopped. See, the people have a right to know, and if I was back in the White House right now, the people would know. See, the thing you've got to understand about a free government is that there's got to be a house cleaning every once in a while. I don't care what branch of the government's involved. Somebody's got to keep an eye on things, and when you can't do that house cleaning because everything's such a damn secret, Well, then we're heading for something that the Founding Fathers didn't have in mind. Secrecy and a free democratic government don't mix. You've got to keep your eye on the military, and I don't give a damn if it's those birds in the Pentagon or the birds in the CIA. Nowadays, they say dropping the bombs on Japan was a mistake. Well, it wasn't. It ended the war in the Pacific. Now, if we'd have had to invade Japan, it could have cost up to 500,000 boys dead and 1 million of them maimed for life. With the bombs, we avoided that, and I'd do it again tomorrow if I had to. You know, the thing I'm most proud of is the Marshall Plan. After the Civil War, Lincoln said he was going to treat the South like a sinful child, not a conquered enemy. Well, after the Second World War, we had to rehabilitate Europe. We destroyed it, and we had to put it back on its feet. Now, for one thing, I doubt that things had ever been worse over there in the Middle Ages, maybe, but not in modern times. People were starving. They were cold. There wasn't enough coal. Tuberculosis was breaking out, and they were having food riots in France and Italy. And if that wasn't enough, the winter of 1947 was the coldest in history. Well, something had to be done. Now, Britain was broke, so we had to do it, and we had to do it all alone. And the people in Congress had to be persuaded that it was necessary. See, the biggest power a president has is the power to persuade people to do what they ought to do without having to be persuaded. And if the man who's president doesn't understand that or thinks he's too big to do the necessary persuading, well, then he's in for a lot of trouble, and so is the country. Well, I called Sam Rayburn in, and when I told him what I had in my mind, he just wouldn't believe it. His first reaction was the same as everybody else's. We couldn't afford it. He says, Harry, it'll bust this country. And I said, Sam, if we don't do it, Europe is going to have the worst depression in history, and I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people are going to starve to death, and I don't want that on my conscience, not if it's something I can prevent. And if we let Europe go down the drain, well, we're going to have a bad depression right here in this country. Now, you and I both lived through one depression, and I don't want to live through another one. Well, he kind of swallowed hard, and he said, well, Harry, how much do you think a thing like that's going to cost? And I looked him right in the eye, and I said $16 billion, and he went white as a sheet. Well, I said, now, just wait a minute, Sam. Now, I saved the country that much with the Truman Committee. Now that the country can pay me back, now that I can save the world with it. And he said, well, Harry, I'll do my damnedest. Well, I knew it was going to go down in history as a great thing, unselfish thing, so I called in General Marshall, and I told him the plan was going to have his name on it, and I didn't want any argument from him because I'd already made up my mind. Well, he blushed. General Marshall is the one exception to all my exceptions about the military. He had about as broad a view of the world as any man alive, and he's the one man you could always count on to be truthful in every way. Well, when you find a man like that, you have to hang on to him. Yes, sir, you have to hang on to him. Well, from 1945 to 1948, what I was doing was filling out Roosevelt's term. But I had some ideas of my own, and to get them carried out, I had to run on my own steam. Now, I knew I'd be able to win. I never had any doubts about that. The Republicans didn't have anybody but Taft or Dewey, and people of this country weren't ready to set the clock back, which is what either of them would have done. Well, at the convention, they told me that if I didn't let up on my Fair Employment Practices Commission and quit asking for a permanent commission on civil rights, that a lot of the Southerners are going to walk out. Well, I said if that happened, that'd be a pity, but I had no intention of running on a watered-down platform that said one thing and meant another. Well, 35 votes walked out and split the solid South. But you can't divide this country into sections, have one set of rules for one section and one for another. And you can't encourage people's prejudices. You have to appeal to their better instincts, not their worse. Now, you might win an election or two by doing the other, but it does a hell of a lot of harm to this country. Now, if Eisenhower had given this country a little bit of leadership, we wouldn't be having all this trouble over desegregating the schools. If he'd have got up and told the people of this country that they had to uphold the law of the land, it's my opinion people would have done it. But he didn't. He shilly-shallied around, and that's the reason we're in the mess we're in right now. And he got us into that mess we're in Cuba, too. He never did understand that a president has to act. Now, when Castro came to power, if I'd have been in this office, I'd have called him direct on that phone to Havana. I wouldn't have bothered with any protocol. I'd have called him direct, and I'd have said, Fidel, this is Harry Truman up in Washington, and I'd like you to come up here and have a little talk. Well, he'd have come, of course. And I'd have said, now, Fidel, seems to me like you've got a pretty good revolution going on down there. Now, you're going to need some help. And there's only two places in this world you're going to get it. One of them's right here, and the other one, well, we both know where that is. Now, you tell me what you want, and I'll see to it that you get it. Well, he'd have thanked me, and we'd have talked for a little while, and then when he got up to leave, I'd have said, now, Fidel, I've told you what we'll do for you. There's something you can do for me. Would you get a shave and a haircut and take a bath? Well, Eisenhower's too dumb to do anything like that. When Castro decided to go in the other direction for support, Eisenhower's probably still sitting around waiting for a goddamn staff report on what to think. Well, there was this old woman at the convention. She was a committee lady from Alabama, and she said to me that she was just sure that I hadn't meant what I said about civil rights, and she wanted to go back down to Alabama and tell them that. Well, the first thing I did, I read her the Bill of Rights. And I doubt very much that she'd ever read it. She probably never even heard of it. And I told her that I said what I said because I meant it. And I had no intention of taking back one word of it, and you can go back down to Alabama and tell them that. The Bill of Rights applies to every person in this country, and don't you ever forget it. Well, I lost her support, but hell, you can always get along without the support of people like that. Well, I traveled 31,700 miles during that campaign. Now, of course, it's all television and jet airplanes, and I don't like that, and I'll tell you why. You see, you get a real feel of the country and of the people when you're riding in a train, speaking from the back of a train, and the further you get away from that, the worse off you are, the worse off the country is. And the easier it is for the stuffed shirts and the counterfeits and the fellows on Madison Avenue to put it over on the people. You see, those people are more interested in selling the people a bill of goods than they are on informing them on the issues. I like to talk to people face to face. They know that when you're on television, you got all that paint and powder on and somebody else put on your face for you, and you didn't even comb your own hair. But when you're standing there and looking at the people and shaking their hands and talking to them and telling them who you are, what you think, and what you stand for, well, then the people can tell if you're telling them the facts or not. And, well, I spoke to, altogether, I suppose, in between 15 and 20 million people during that campaign, face to face. Well, we ran out of money again, Oklahoma this time, and some of the people started to panic, saying we're going to have to cancel the rest of the trip, and I don't know what all, but, well, we raised it somehow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to finish that trip and take another one. Well, there was never much money in any of my campaigns, and that's the way it ought to be. When people are anxious to give you a lot of money for a political campaign, you always have to ask yourself what the reason for it is. People just don't go giving money away for no reason. They're going to want to get something for it, and you have to keep that in your mind. Well, I wound up the campaign in Independence like I always did. And on Election Day after voting, I had lunch with some of my old friends. And not one of them thought I had a prayer. Well, nobody did. The polls all said that Dewey was a shoo-in, and the radio networks had scheduled his victory speech for 9 p.m. There was only 2 people in this country thought I was going to win, me and Lester Biffle. Well, Biffle, he was a particular friend of mine. He was a secretary in the Senate. And he got dressed up in some overalls, and he got in a spring wagon, and he went around like a chicken peddler, talking to people. Well, he called me just before the election, when the polls were trying to decide how much Dewey was going to win by. He called me up, and he said, "Now, Harry, you listen to me. You got nothing to worry about, you hear? The common people are for you." Well, they were. Well, Tom Evans called me about midnight to tell me that I'd lost New York. And I said, "Tom, I'm going to carry Ohio, Illinois, and California, and I'm going back to bed, and I want to get some sleep, and I don't want to hear from you anymore." Well, the Secret Service called me about 4:30 to tell me I'd been elected. Well, I got up and I got dressed and I took my walk as usual. You know, a brisk walk in the morning of a mile or so is about the best exercise a man can get after a certain age. Well, after that, I drove over to the Mulebach Hotel to celebrate. Well, I won without the Solid South and without New York, which wasn't supposed to be able to be done. It hadn't been done before, and it hasn't been done since. Well, I take pleasure in that. In Korea, I believe that at the same time we risked the Third World War, we prevented the Third World War. I was home in Independence for the weekend, and I was in the living room reading, and telephone rang, and Margot went to answer it, and then she came back in and said, "Daddy, it's Dean Acheson, and he says it's important." Well, I went to the phone, and he said, "Mr. President, I have serious news. The North Koreans are attacking across the 38th parallel." Well, I wanted to get on the plane that night and fly back to Washington then and there, but he said no, that wouldn't be necessary, that I should stand by and wait for another call from him when he had more details. Well, the following day, the attack was known to be in force all along the parallel, and I said, "Dean, those sons of bitches have got to be stopped no matter what." And he agreed with me. And he said that an emergency meeting of the Security Council had been set up for that afternoon. Well, on the flight back to Washington, I got to thinking about the fact that what the communists were up to is nothing new at all. Hitler, Mussolini, the Japs had done exactly the same thing in the 30s, and the League of Nations let them get away with it. Nobody stood up to them, and that's what led to the Second World War. The strong got away with attacking the weak. Well, I wasn't about to let this attack on the Republic of Korea, which had been set up by the United Nations, go forward. Because if it wasn't stopped, it would have led to the Third World War. And I wasn't about to let that happen, not while I was president. And that's one thing that a lot of people never understood, including General MacArthur, who was over there at the time. This was a limited war, a police action, whatever you want to call it, to stop aggression and prevent a big war. And that's all it ever was. And some people just could not get that through their heads. MacArthur, right from the beginning, he wanted to use Chiang Kai-shek's troops in Korea. Well, old Chiang's objective was to reestablish himself in mainland China. Well, that was not my objective. Also, any money we sent to support Chiang's troops would end up in Madam's pockets. She and Chiang were nothing but thieves, common thieves. They stole $750 million of the $35 billion we sent to Formosa. They stole it, and it's invested in real estate down in Sao Paulo and in New York City, and I don't like that at all. I don't want anything to do with people like that. So I sent Averell Harriman over to Tokyo to get MacArthur cleared up on anything he maybe didn't understand, and afterwards, Harriman said that MacArthur understood why Chiang's troops weren't to be used in Korea and why it had to be a limited war. And he said that he would, as a soldier, obey any orders he received from the president. Well, I thought that was that, and I should have known better. MacArthur was the kind of man you just couldn't depend on. Now, Roosevelt had all kinds of trouble with him in the Second World War. He was the sort of man that just couldn't sleep easy at night unless he was thinking up ways and means of getting himself and everybody else into trouble. In August, he sent a message to the veterans of foreign wars saying we ought to encourage Chiang to invade China. Well, there were times, I'm afraid, when he just wasn't right in the head. Now, for one thing, he didn't have anybody around him to keep him in line. Everybody on his staff was an ass-kisser, and so there were times, I think, that, well, he just didn't know what he was doing. And I'm sorry as I can be about a thing like that. Well, that's the day I should have fired him, and I told them that's what I wanted to do, and I wanted to replace him with General Bradley, but, well, they talked me out of it. They said that caused too much of an uproar over here, so I didn't do it, and I was wrong. We might have been out of Korea 6 months earlier. I don't know for sure. You see, when you feel there's something that you have to do and you feel in your gut you have to do it, the sooner you get it over with, the better off everybody is. Well, in September, MacArthur launched a surprise attack, and in 2 weeks he had secured Korea right up to the 38th parallel, and, well, I thought that'd be a good time for me to tell him in person that that's all the further he used to go. Well, the damn fool hadn't been back in the United States for 14 years or more, and all the messages I sent to him through other people, he, somehow or other, he never seemed to understand. So I decided I'd bring him to the White House. Well, General Marshall, he said no. He said that that man is a living legend among certain groups and certain members of Congress, and that if I brought him over here, it might do more harm than good. Well, he was right, of course. He was always right, 99% of the time anyway, so I went to Wake Island. Well, the son of a bitch walked out of one of those buildings by the airport there, and he had on those damn sunglasses of his and a shirt that was unbuttoned and a frayed cap with a lot of hardware on it. He had somebody on his staff did nothing but fray his caps for him. I never did understand it. An old man like that, and he was 70 years old, and why he ran around dressed up like a 19-year-old second lieutenant. I'll tell you what, if he'd have been a lieutenant in my outfit and ran around dressed up like that, I'd have busted him so fast he wouldn't have known what happened to him. But I overlooked his get-up, and we shook hands and arranged a meeting. Well, I was there on time, and he was 45 minutes late. And I said to him when he walked in, now, you look here. I don't give a good goddamn what you think of Harry Truman, but don't you ever keep your commander-in-chief waiting. Is that clear? Well, his face got red as a beet, and he said it was. He was like a little puppy at that meeting. I don't know which is worse, the way he acted in public or the way he kissed my ass at that meeting. Well, I made it abundantly clear to him just what we were up to in Korea and who was in charge of the show and who was to obey orders and who was to keep his mouth shut. Well, only a couple of days after I got back to Washington, he was across the 38th parallel asking for permission to bomb the bridges over the Yalu, to bomb Manchuria, and permission to invade China. Well, I denied him permission. By Christmas, the communists had pushed him back to the 38th parallel, and at that point, I wanted him to negotiate a ceasefire. And at that point, he proposed bombing China's industrial cities, blockading the coast, and bringing in Chiang Kai-shek. Well, now, if any of that had been allowed to happen, we would have been at war not only with Red China, but with Russia, too. A third world war. Well, I called everybody together, General Marshall, General Bradley, Atchison, Harriman, some others, and I said, I want to fire that son of a bitch right now. And they all agreed with me, except General Marshall. And he said he thought that was going to cause a lot of trouble in Congress as far as the defense budget was concerned, and he wanted some time to think over what the reaction of the troops would be. And I said, all right, General. I want you to read all the correspondence that's passed between MacArthur and me in the last 2 years. And then I want you in this office at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and if you still think I shouldn't fire him, I won't. Well, I was here at 8:15, and he was out there waiting for me, and he said, I spent half the night on that file, Mr. President. You should have fired that son of a bitch 2 years ago. Well, General Bradley came by that night, and he told me that the Chicago Tribune had gotten wind of the story. And if MacArthur found out about it before he was officially notified, he'd resign. And I told Bradley, that son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. I want him fired. So they held a press conference right there that night, and they read my statement, relieving MacArthur of his duties and turning him over to General Ridgway. Well, that was that. Well, they burned me in effigy in Ponca City, Oklahoma. Joe McCarthy said I was a traitor. That was his favorite word, and that I ought to be impeached. And the letters poured into the White House, 20-1 against me. But I was used to being vilified. It has its stimulating aspects, and for all I know, it might even be good for the liver. Well, in April, MacArthur landed in San Francisco, and all hell broke loose. He stood on the gangplank of that ship, and he spread his arms, and he said, the only politics I have is contained in the single phrase, God bless America. Well, 7.5 million people welcomed him to the streets of New York, 800 tons of confetti, and 300,000 people lining the streets of Washington, and not a dry eye anywhere. And then he went and made that old soldiers never die, they just fade away speech to Congress. That man was full of bullshit. Well, there was a lot of carrying on about that speech, I can tell you. Some of those damn fool congressmen were crying like a bunch of old women, but it didn't worry me. Because I knew that once the hubbub died down, the people would see what he was, and I figured it'd take about 6 weeks, and it did. You see, the American people can always see through a counterfeit. Now, sometimes it takes a little time, but they can always spot one. And MacArthur, I'll tell you, if there was ever a counterfeit club, he'd have been the president of it, and he wouldn't have had to run for it either. He'd have been elected unanimously. He was a man that there just wasn't anything real about. Well, people who think they're God are bound to get into trouble sooner or later. You see, what you have to understand is that the people of this country are men and women of common sense, and whenever anybody gets too far out of line, the people are going to take charge and put him out of business. Well, in 1950, they convicted Alger Hiss of perjury. Now, whether he was guilty or not, he was a close friend of Atchison's, and Atchison felt that his association with Hiss was going to jeopardize his effectiveness, so he brought me his resignation. Well, I said to him, Dean, about this resignation. Now, this is the first time you ever brought me a decision late in the afternoon, and don't do it again. Well, he said he wouldn't, and he didn't. You see, people were hysterical over communism. And they said my veto of the McCarran Act would cause the Democratic Party to lose votes. Well, maybe it did. But when the whole country is off the beam like that, why then it's up to the president to speak out for what's right. Otherwise, he's got no business being in this office. The president has to be a leader in a case like that. And when there's a moral issue involved, like the violation of the Constitution, why then the president has to be the moral leader of this country. You see, he's the only one elected to represent the whole people. He isn't elected to pull strings for any special interest groups. He's elected to be the lobbyist for every person in this country. And he is, too, if he's any good. You know, some people will tell you to hold your fire on this and that because telling the truth might offend. Well, whenever I took advice like that, I never thought much of myself, so I didn't take it very often. In 1952, I was up in Massachusetts campaigning for Stevenson, and old man Kennedy told me to lay off Joe McCarthy. The core of the party is Irish, and the Irish love that son of a bitch. Talk about Hoover, he said. People don't have to be told why they hate Hoover. Well, now, the Republican National Committee had given Eisenhower the lay-off McCarthy warnings, and Eisenhower took it like a good soldier. Now, me, I walked into Boston Symphony Hall, and I told them that Joe McCarthy was a moral pygmy. And he was a coward. Wait, you take any of those damn demagogues, they're all cowards anyway. I cussed him out every chance I got. Well, now, personally, I just don't think he was mentally complete. Now, the danger, of course, is in the people who knew that that man was up to no good, but who encouraged him anyway for strictly partisan reasons. Now, Senator Taft knew damn well that what McCarthy was saying wasn't true. But he said that if McCarthy didn't get his facts right in one case, well, he ought to go right on accusing people till he got to one where he did. Well, that's where the real danger lies. It isn't only the demagogues, it's the people who encourage them, people who do any damn thing in this world to win an election. They're every bit as bad. Well, you take the Kennedys, for instance. Now, as nearly as I can make out, they're only interested in getting the power, and when they get it, they're afraid to use it because it might not be popular. Now, all the time John was in the Senate and all the time he could have provided leadership, as far as Joe McCarthy was concerned, he never did do it. His ears were so close to the ground, they were full of grasshoppers. Well, before I left the big white jail, I returned a pencil to the Oval Office. Everything in here belongs to the people. I was privileged to use it for a while, that's it. That's all there is to it. And since it was only lent to me, and that includes the powers of the presidency, I had to take great care to see to it that it was passed on to the next fellow in the best condition possible. And for the most part, I think you can say I succeeded. I only wish that next fellow had been somebody else. Well, right after the Second World War, Eisenhower wrote a letter to General Marshall saying he wanted to come back to the States and divorce Mamie and marry some English woman who I believe was his Jeep driver. Well, General Marshall wrote back a letter the likes of which I never did see. He said that if Eisenhower even came close to doing such a thing, he'd not only bust him out of the Army, but he'd see to it that for the rest of his life he didn't draw a peaceful breath. He'd see to it the rest of his life was a living hell. Now General Marshall, he didn't very often lose his temper, but when he did, it was a corker. Well, I don't like Eisenhower, you know that, and I never have, but one of the last things I did as president, I went over to the Pentagon and I got those letters out of his file and I destroyed them. And then I went back to independence and that was that. I carried the grips up to the attic and we were home. You know, they had a big discussion, the Founding Fathers, at that meeting in Philadelphia about what to do about ex-presidents. And Alexander Hamilton, I believe it was, he said that he thought it'd be a terrible thing to degrade them by putting them back amongst the common people after they'd had all that power. Well, old Ben Franklin, he didn't agree with him. He said, if I can remember it, in free governments, the ruler is the servant and the people his superiors and sovereigns. And therefore, to return the ruler to the common people is not to degrade them, but to promote them. Well, I kept that in my mind when I was in the White House, and I've kept it in my mind ever since. I got my promotion.
Tomorrow at 10 on Movie City Showcase, it's Dickens' Victorian masterpiece, Nicholas Nickleby. Sir Cedric Hardwicke stars as the villainous uncle who'll do almost anything to make poor Nicholas miserable. Will Nicholas triumph over such adversity? Find out on the Movie City Showcase presentation of Nicholas Nickleby tomorrow night at 10.
Presentation of this program was made possible by grants from Ford Motor Company. At Ford, quality is job one. And Ford Aerospace and Communications Corporation. Domino's Pizza, with more than 1,500 stores nationwide. And the Laurel Corporation, an international high-technology company committed to the leading edge of defense electronics and communications.